all. Welcome everybody to this amazing talk of CFO deal, regulation and acquisition with our fantastic alumni, Joe Moran and Vasant Prabhu. My name is Ajay Manglani. I have the pleasure to be a part of our alumni club here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I would like to kick us off with this discussion. Before I do that, Joe and Vasant, are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
And I can hear you well as well, so thank you. First of all, by now, we are all familiar with this virtual way of operating, but I do want to cover a couple of quick housekeeping items. So this is a Zoom webinar. Please try to keep yourself muted. By default, you are all muted and your video is hidden. If you have any questions that you want to ask, please feel free throughout the discussion to add your questions under the Q&A section. That will come to our panelist and myself, and we will make sure that they are being answered by both Joe and Vasant at this time. You can also hand raise if you want to call out any areas. So with that said, here's the structure for our overall deal talk today. We will have introduction of both Joe and Vasant in a moment. We'll focus about 40 minutes on the deal talk. I will try to consolidate all the questions and leave them towards the end. So Joe and Vasant have had the opportunity to continue with the flow of their discussion. But if there are any questions that you would like to be asked at the moment in time, like I said, please feel free to mention that and I will chime in as well. And we will try to end with 5 minutes at the end with closing remarks. So with that said, I am delighted to introduce you to both Joe and Vasant. Both of them have very distinguished career path. They are, of course, the Chicago Booth alumni. I'm sure you all read about their very impressive bios, so I will not go line by line, but would like to introduce Joe, who is currently the Chief Financial Officer at KeepTruckin, a growth startup. And formerly, he was the Chief Financial Officer of Looker, the company that got acquired for $2.6 billion by Google. And those are some of the things that Joe will share today. Joe, in addition to these two companies, have had a long-standing and impressive career of over 20 plus years, working in the capacity of CFO for multiple venture-backed organizations, of which one went public and two other were at the process of S1 and then later on getting acquired. Obviously, Joe is part of the Chicago Booth MBA, and he was prior to that at Berkeley. Vasant is also one of our distinguished alumnus. He is currently the Executive Vice President, CFO, and Vice Chair of Visa, and has held distinguished roles with many different organizations, including NBC Universal, where he was the CFO before, and prior to that, he was also the Vice Chair and CFO at Starwood Hotels. And prior to that, he was VP CFO and President of e-commerce at Safeway. Again, there are many things I can say about both of them, but I'm sure you can read about them more on their bios and other things. So without any further ado, I would like to thank both Joe and Vasant for being available today to talk about this amazing discussion topic. And with that, I would like to hand over to both Joe and Vasant.
Thank you, Ajay. It's great to be doing this with you all. So I'm going to be I'm going to be the interrogator here. So Joe's going to have to answer the questions I ask him, I guess. And hopefully, you'll find this an interesting and useful conversation. So Joe, I just noticed that you graduated from what was then called the GS, the Graduate School of Business. That's how we knew it, in the mid 80s. And I was a couple of years, I think, before you. So we're sort of the same vintage, which means we've been around a long time. I thought we'd start with a little bit of background, questions so that people get to know you a little better. How did you end up becoming a CFO, and how did you end up at Looker? It might be helpful for people to, many on the call, maybe early in their careers. I'm sure they'd love to hear how you got to be where you are.
Yeah, well, it's as you said, it was we are of a certain vintage, and so it's kind of a long and winding road that gets me there. But my career in tech actually began about 3 or 4 years after I had left Booth. I started at a company called Tandem Computers back in about '89, and it was a hardware company that sold computers to stock exchanges that needed high reliance. I moved into the software world at a company called Sybase in a corporate finance role. It was a small group at the time. It was a private company that subsequently went public. It was a database software company that in the mid 90s, was actually a real competitor to Oracle. I was at Sybase for about 7 years, where the company grew from about 80 million in revenue to a little over $1 billion. And I left there as VP Finance and joined a startup company, enterprise software, in the late 90s, just as .com was really taking off. And this was my first experience as a CFO. And one thing I learned, that when you become a CFO for the first time, you learn about how much you really don't know. And so it was a hard experience. I learned a lot during that period of time. The company eventually went public. I left there and then went to a second enterprise software company that also came to the point of an S1, but did not go public because of the .com bust. And actually spent the next about 12 years at various venture-backed technology companies as CFO. I landed at Looker in 2013. I actually joined a team that I had worked with years before, and had stayed in contact with them, and we brought these people back together. It was very early stage when I joined. There were about 20 people, and was CFO from that early stage up through the closing of our deal earlier this year.
Yeah, you said something that I think about too, which is, my first job as CFO. And when I look back on it, I'm scared about how little I knew. And I really it was a real risk people took on you when they put you in those jobs, because you could do a lot of damage because you don't know a lot.
You don't, and you begin to know that you always have to ask questions. And I think if it's the one thing I learned in that first job, is never be afraid to ask a question to find out what's going on.
Exactly. Curiosity never hurts you. That's one thing you learn. So let's talk about Looker for a minute. I'm sure there are people on the call who have done their research on Looker and know what it is, but let's assume people haven't. Why don't you give everybody a quick layman's description of what Looker is?
Sure. Well, Looker is a data analytics platform that allows you to integrate all of your business data and allows you to work it or meld it into work processes that people can actually work around. And the idea behind Looker is the more you bring your data together from various sources, the more you know and the more valuable your data actually is. And so we grew up at about the same time that the cloud databases really grew up. So the Amazons of the world, Google began to start in that stage, and then a few years later, you saw Snowflake starting. And really, what was happening here is people were bringing all their data into the cloud, and so they needed an analytics platform upon which they could actually bring that data together, understand it, and in the context of their own business. In that world, it's really important to have partnerships and the ability to work with your primary data sources. And those really, as I mentioned, were Amazon, it was Google Cloud, it was Snowflake, and a lot of the other smaller providers out there that were more of on-prem type of people. When we were acquired, we had about 2,500 customers. They range from very small companies to the largest Fortune 500 companies. And, a typical contract for a year would range from, $25,000 a year to many millions at the large end. When we were acquired, we were about 1,000 employees. We grew in my time there from about 20 employees to about 1,000, and then expanded overseas to Japan, UK, Ireland. And so we had customers in most countries around the world.
Great. So, of course, Google now is the proud owner of Looker. Let's go back to the very beginning, right? If you want to call it the mating dance or whatever, maybe it wasn't a mating dance. You'll tell us what it was. How did this all start? How did the whole concept of you possibly doing a deal with Google, how did it get going?
Well, I think to really understand how it got going, you have to go back about 4 years prior to the actual phone call. And this was, as I mentioned, we had to work closely with the places where the data resided for our customers. And so we had to create these partnerships with those companies. And so early on, we developed a sales relationship with Google, with Google Cloud and their BigQuery product. And so the idea there was that the way they charge for their business was based upon the volume of queries and data flow that happens out of their database. And so how do you make that happen? Well, you have applications that actually drive the usage by their customers onto their database. And so one of the primary applications for that is data analytics. How do you understand your data? How do you understand what's going on in your business? And so it turned out that our particular technical architecture allowed that to happen very easily with Google BigQuery. And so we began to develop a good field relationship where they would bring us into deals to help them close and show the power of what BigQuery brought and what our application could then do. So it's kind of we both got something out of it. We got introductions into deals that we would never be able to do. And they got an application that showed the power of what their product is and then drove all the usage post-close. As that happened over time, it became obvious to us and to Google that it really would help if we kind of worked together to understand where our products were going. And so our engineers began to work together, our product managers began to work together to understand technically where they were going and what the capabilities were of each other's product. And Google is a very engineering-centric organization. They really have a lot of power inside that organization. And there was I think a mutual respect between the engineering teams, which goes a long way inside of Google. And so we began to really work much closely on the product level, had that respect. And over the course of time, we about 1/3 of our customers actually house their data in BigQuery. And so it was a very, and it was growing quickly. It was a very strong relationship and one in which we knew each other very well. And so when the call finally came in from Google, it was back in February of 2019. It actually was not completely unexpected. Just prior to the call, about 4 months prior, Google Cloud had brought over a person from Oracle whose charter was to make Google Cloud a bigger player in the cloud business. They were a distant third behind Amazon and Microsoft. And we knew that in order to really play in the game and be a player in that market, they had to have a bit more of an application focus such that they could actually have those kinds of conversations with more senior leaders in their customer base. And so given our relationship, we thought we would be a primary target, but we did not know. But it was, that call was 4 years in the making. And so it's not a complete surprise, but it was a set of circumstances that made it happen at that time.
So, I've always been on the other side, unfortunately. I've always been the acquirer, not the acquiree.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered, the companies we talk to, what was really going on, right? And maybe you can tell me how things are going on at your end. You may have been heads down, building a business, and all of a sudden somebody comes in and says, how about buying you out? You're then faced with a decision on, you know, do I want to sell? Do I not? I don't know what your status was exactly. You know, were you looking for a liquidity event? Were you just too busy building the business? You're really not looking to sell? How was it?
Yeah. So interestingly, we had already begun to write our S1. We were planning to target going public in June of that year. We were in the midst of working with the bankers on fee splits, and really putting together what our investor pitch would look like. And so when the call came in, we had a big part of the company focused on going public. We had spent about the last 18 months getting ready to be a public company. We were of the right size. And so the conversation really came down to, what is the value of being bought today versus what we thought we could do from building value over time as a public company, and the risk associated with that. And you know, there's execution risk once you go public, and there is a timing difference between when you actually realize your gain and when you actually can actually give return to investors. The other piece of it was that we also wanted to take into account how we best protected our employees and our customers and our investors. And so all of these things were put into the mix. When you've worked at a startup company for 6 or 7 years and you're on the cusp of going public, it is a difficult call, especially as a CFO, to say, maybe that's not the right thing to do. And so it sparked a very lively conversation between the management team and the board. And it was not a clear-cut call. There were two factions on the board. One were firmly convinced, just given our track record, that we could build a lot more value going public. And the other faction was, this is a really good return. By all metrics, in terms of how you measure value for a company at our stage, this was at the very high end of the range. And so we did not know what the future would hold. And so $1 today is worth more, especially if it's certain. And so it was a tough conversation. It took us about 4 weeks to come to a conclusion that we would actually talk more about it. And the final call was not made until we kind of worked out the terms. But it was not a clear-cut path.
So I'm just curious how you decide, what was an acceptable value, right? Having been on the other side, companies like the state Looker is in, high growth companies. And I think you sold at, you correct me if this is wrong, something like 20 times revenue or something like that.
Yeah, it was about 20
all the value. I'm sorry?
It was actually about 20 times trailing 12 months. That's right.
Exactly. As you know, and we've got a lot of financial modelers on the call, I'm sure, you all know that when you run your valuation models, all the value is going to be in the terminal value, what I call the hopes and dreams of whoever is buying and the hopes and dreams of whoever is selling. Mm-hmm. There's no very real objective way of valuing companies that are high growth. There are always other metrics, other people, like what did other people pay and things like that. But in the end, you sort of have a point of view on how much you're worth. Google has a point of view on how much they're willing to pay. And it's not an exact science. It's not mathematically modelable. How did you decide what was fine? What was acceptable?
Yeah, so it was an interesting process to go through. So we actually did hire an advisor for this process and we also wanted to make sure from an oversight view that we actually did talk to other people in the process. So part of it was, are there others out there who would be interested? And then secondly, looking at, as you mentioned, other comparable transactions, of which there had been several prior, and looking at our growth path and the certainty that we had post going public, of which, you know, one can never be certain. But the other piece of it is all the other terms in the deal itself. And so, you know, one of the things that came out in this whole process is sometimes you're willing to trade off the actual headline value for other pieces in the deal itself. For us, as an example, a very key factor for us was how the employees would be treated post close. And so the price actually was sort of the banner headline, but I think what we all walked away most proud of is the fact that every single employee got at least a short-term contract out of Google or were taken on full-time, but they also completely vested in all of their stock. So everybody who helped build the company got value out of the deal. And to us, you know, you have to weigh other factors other than just the headline price.
So you mentioned that there were different perspectives on whether we should sell now or not sell now, go public or sell, different perspectives on valuation. How does that dynamic all work out between a board and management? Management includes founders, of course. Just give us a little bit of the, you know, inside the inside the room kind of perspective on. I've always wondered about it as to how it works on the other side.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit, you know, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah. So, you know, I think, you know, we had been around, or I had been with the company about 6 years by that time, but the company had been in existence for about 8 years. And, you know, over the course of time, we had multiple rounds of funding. And so we had investors coming in at various stages of the company. And we had, interestingly, just closed a round of funding about 5 months before we got the call. And so the perspective on that last investor is very different than the view of that first investor, because their return looks so much different. And so when you're talking internally, you get that dynamic. You know, what are people's expectations of a return? And then secondly, we had by that time had brought on some independent board members. And I think their view was really leading towards more, they really felt this could be a successful public company. They would then, of course, be a public company board member with all its pros and cons that go with that. But the idea is that would be something that they were looking forward to actually when they came on board. And so you were balancing all those perspectives. Ultimately, though, I think that if it came down to it and the management team wanted to do it, they would have the forcing hand, because the company relied on the management team to actually run the company. And there was a lot of value that was inherent in them being able to do that under Google. And so if the management team had said the opposite, it probably would have gone that way too.
That's great, Joe. So, you know, this has been billed as a discussion about the regulatory aspects of transactions. So I want to definitely spend at least 15 minutes on that. And as you know, every transaction has many, many, many dimensions that we could all talk about. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to go through everything you considered as you were going through this process, but how much did the regulatory dimension factor as you were thinking about the sale? Like, how much did you guys think about it when you were considering the offer?
It was a very big factor, and it went into the structure of the deal too. So, as everybody knows, they are a target of regulators around the world. We did feel that because this market that we were in and Google Cloud was in was so separate from where the other countries and regulators were focused in terms of their strength in the market, that we didn't think we would get as much scrutiny, but we did work to get a breakup fee in the deal. We did put timelines on it such that we weren't forever stretched out in terms of when this deal might close because of any regulatory review process. So it went into the structure of the deal, and it was a concern going in what I think we didn't realize is how much of a concern it should have been, because it ended up taking a lot longer and had a lot more scrutiny than we had thought going in.
So you obviously considered it, and you put in a couple of things to protect your side, your value, a breakup fee in case it couldn't be done, as well as you gave yourself some timelines because you can't be in limbo forever. So you had the option of exiting the deal if this was just dragging on and on.
That's right.
So you went in with your eyes open, clearly. So then you announced the deal, and then what happened from the regulatory side that you didn't expect?
Well, it was interesting. I'll put a little bit of background because I think it enters into it. We announced our deal on a Wednesday. Our biggest competitor was a company called Tableau. They announced 5 days later that they were being acquired by Salesforce. And the combination of the two events, I think, started to set off a series of alarms in various regulatory offices around the world. And so what we did not expect was that heightened the visibility, I think, of both deals because they happened so close to each other. And what it then brought to the fore was that because of the heightened press and visibility, that there would be more scrutiny, because we did feel that there had to be scrutiny because of the buyer, and no regulator wants to be in a position where if they get questioned that they did not give the company a bad time in getting through the process because of all the other concerns they might have about other markets that they were in. So we ended up in a regulatory process with, I think, 5 countries, the US, Australia, the UK, Austria of all places, and to a certain extent, Japan.
So, regulators often are talked about as regulators, right? But when you go through this entity called regulators, but when you go through a deal like this, you actually get to know who these people really are. Mm-hmm. Who is this regulator? Tell us a little bit about what you learned about who some of the, the real sort of active regulators are around the world, the ones who really look at these kinds of deals, who are set up to do it, who can be very aggressive, very intrusive, etc. Who are the regulators that people who want to do deals like this should know about?
Well, I think there are 2 answers to that. One is, actually, I'll tell you the answer. The UK actually turned out to be the most difficult one to go through. It's the Competitive Market Authority, or CMA.
The CMA, right.
Yeah, and so they actually spent a great deal of time, and they in their regulatory framework, they have certain steps in their process of review and certain timelines that they have to meet. And if you hit the end of that, they then have to take a formal process to go into the next step. And each step along the way has a great demand upon each of the companies involved in terms of the data that they want from each of you to try and understand the market that you're operating in, to whether this transaction would be anti-competitive. And the amount of analysis that they do, or the amount of data that they ask from each of us, is immense. And I think that was a bit surprising. And the extent to which the CMA went to try and craft a case where our market plus their market would end up being anti-competitive. And they have certain thresholds they have to meet. The combined has to, I think, hit 25% of a market. And they had a very hard time finding it. And they kept on asking for more and more data to try and prove their case. And so the UK CMA was very difficult. The Department of Justice was the second most difficult. The interesting thing here is that early in the process, the FTC and the Department of Justice could not decide who would have jurisdiction over our deal, because there had been no deals that had been done in cloud computing. And so they often operate on precedent. Who's ever already done deals in this particular market would take lead. And so we actually had to wait 6 weeks for them to figure out who was going to do it. And so it delayed our process there. Eventually, the Department of Justice took it. And we found that they were very undereducated in terms of the dynamics of the market in which we operated. And so one of the critical things we had to do was actually spend time with them and educate them about how the market worked and why it was distinct from the other areas of Google, and how in this particular market, they were a distant third. That was a very useful thing. And then when we found how well it worked, we actually volunteered to do it with a CMA. And we did it. I think it helped, but they were still bent on trying to find a market in which we were anti-competitive. So it was very active. The interesting thing in this process is that regulators talk to each other around the world, and they coordinate the way they ask the questions. And certain jurisdictions have different laws that allow more flexibility in terms of extending out the timeline. And Austria was one of those that had some looser rules around how to manage it, but they did not have the staff in which to manage it. And so what they did is they worked closely with the UK CMA to understand what the UK was looking for, so that Austria could string us along and UK would have more time to actually go and look at the deal. So one of the things you really have to recognize is that it will be, if it's a controversial acquisition, there will be a lot of coordination among countries around the world.
So, you were the acquired company. Google was clearly the one they were more interested in, I would imagine. What role does Google play in this situation with regulators versus the role you as the acquired company would play? Yeah. Who sort of takes the lead? Who follows? Is it more equal? Do you get pulled in when you're needed? Is it Google really handling most of it? How does it all work?
It's Google handling most of it. They are lead. They are the acquirer. They set the terms by which we, under what our legal approach would be. We support. We certainly had to support in terms of the data that was provided. We consult with them when we can. They often don't want to listen, but we felt it was important to, in terms of our market, that they understand a few of the nuances because they did not operate in our market. But ultimately, it's Google's call, the acquirer's call as to how they approach it and what they do. But we do have to provide a lot of support to actually make that happen.
And give people a feel for, how the process works, right? There's big data requests, you comply with them. Mm-hmm. Then what? Then there's more data requests, you comply with them, then what? Like, just give us a lay of the land of sort of how the entire process look like, so people get a feel for it.
Yeah, so there is a standard list which they send out to start, and that begins their process of inquiry, and it includes as I mentioned earlier, we had about 2,500 customers, but they wanted to know the entire history of every single one of those customers from inception through all the renewals and changes in contracts and churn customers out. As an example, as a subset of the data, they wanted all the data that related to the executive correspondence around the deal on both sides to see if there was some sort of anti-competitive view in terms of the correspondence there. That was the first request. It took us about 4 weeks to actually fulfill it. The follow-on requests were somewhat smaller, but they took a lot of effort. There were 17 requests in that cycle out of the Department of Justice. We eventually got through it, but it was a very heavy lift. But every time that you go through a cycle, it prompts further questions and further details that you have to provide.
So now that you've gone through this process and you refer to a few items already, what are 5 things or maybe 3 things that you would tell people before you do a deal, as you're thinking about the regulatory review that's going to happen, especially if you're going to sell to a very large company that is always going to be scrutinized? what would be those 4, 5, 3 things you think people should make sure they've thought through?
Yeah, well, I think, as I had mentioned earlier, we were in the process of going public, and in the S1 process, but we had spent 18 months becoming public ready. And really, what that means is you've got your data together, your processes and controls together, your customers' data that you have internally. And that process of getting public ready actually helped us respond in the process of going through the regulatory process. It was much easier to get to the information that we needed. It helped that we were a data company. That always helps because we used our own product internally. But there is a lot of documentation that needs to be provided, and having your internal house in order allows you to do that. In the same vein, it also helps you through the diligence process with the acquirer too, because you can actually, one is you can get the data, but two, it gives them confidence that you have your act together and they're seeing everything. The other thing is the regulator's review is intense. As I talked about the huge data requests, they're very time consuming on the company. You cannot assume that the regulators understand what you do. You have to assume that you need to explain things, that education is a very important part of the process of the parties to actually go through that. I think that the other things that that we've learned is that you have to communicate a lot once this thing is announced. You need to keep your employees sort of in the loop about what's going on. Having a vacuum of information can be very detrimental to how people think about what's going on and the worry about what that might be. And so this constant communication is important. You also have to be clear with your customers about what's going on. How will this work out for them? For us, it turned out that several of our customers actually went away because they were competitors to Google and they didn't want to be part of that environment. And so we actually lost a few of them along the way. So, and the last thing I'd say is going into a deal like this or going into an acquisition, you should know your priorities. What is most important to you to get out of the deal? I mentioned earlier that it was very important for us to make sure that our employees were treated well. You can't get everything you want. The stronger you are, the more you'll get. But you need to know what's really important because you will have to make trade-offs and you will have to, realize that, there are certain things that you might think are important that just won't happen. And so, I think having that understanding about the give and take of the process is really important too.
So you just mentioned the period, post the announcement of the deal. So here you are, you've just got a great price for the company. Mm-hmm. Everybody in the company is like very excited about what just happened. Yeah. Some may be a little concerned about what life under Google might be like and all that. And then here you go into this limbo situation, mm-hmm. right? Which drags on month after month. A lot of people don't even know that a regulatory approval is required. A lot of people in the company may not even have realized that, in the organization in general. Then all of a sudden you're in this situation where for months the deal hasn't closed. How do you run the company in that mode? Because you also have to worry, there's a small possibility the deal may not be approved. You don't want to lose value. You don't want to lose momentum. Tell us a little bit about that limbo period.
It is a difficult period. So as part of the agreement, we did have some high-level constraints on what we could do. We could not make certain large commitments under the agreement, and there were certain types of contractual arrangements that we could not enter into without Google's approval. But in this period, we have to be very, very careful about how we communicate with Google and how they communicate with us, because they can't be seen as sort of gun jumping, in essence, trying to take control of the company prior to the actual approval. And so there is a high degree of review that's done by the regulators during this process to make sure that doesn't happen. And very strict controls were set up in terms of who at Looker was supposed to talk to who at Google. It was very, very channeled. But it's very difficult because as a startup company, you are used to being very nimble in your decisions and you move quickly. And in this situation, you are highly constrained in what you can do. And even hiring is being constrained. So you have to understand those constraints. And I think it's going back to, it's really key to have a clear message to your customers and your prospects about who you are and what the deal will mean for them. Internal communication, but also recognizing that employees will be highly frustrated because the initial read Google was this deal would be closed in 6 months and we would be all one company. It ended up taking 8 when the final approval came through from the UK earlier this year. So it is a difficult environment in which to work. You're highly constrained and you have to be aware of people's angst about what will happen.
So let me ask you one last question, Joe, and then we'll turn it over to Ajay for questions that came from the audience.
Yeah.
Tell us about the whole integration part of acquisitions, right? Which is one of the most difficult things and often underestimated because buying a company is one thing, making it successful is a whole different challenge. Tell us about it, what you saw, any sort of points of view you have on that, and things that people might find useful about how you prepare to integrate an acquisition.
Yeah, so one thing you can do in this period between the announcement and the actual approval of the deal is you can plan. You can work with Google to plan what the integration will look like. And so we spent a lot of time with them, helping them understand our data architecture. So where all of our data resides, what our systems look like, the various skill sets of people that are in charge of those various processes. And so you can spend time conceptually about what things will be post-close, but you can't do anything about it. And so we spent 8 months doing that. And one thing became very clear is in many ways, I think we came into this deal with the understanding that Google had a lot of their processes together around how to do this integration. And I think what we found is that was not the case. And so in many ways, we were actually helping them take the lead on certain types of activities in terms of how we would handle data. They were not an enterprise software company, we were, so we spent a lot of time talking about how commission plans should work as an example in the combined entity. But there is a growing realization that no matter how much you think you can do things better, you will be part of a very much larger umbrella and you will have to integrate into that process.
Yeah, that's always the challenge, right? When you go from being a nimble, fast-moving, rocket ship to working for a very large enterprise, it's always the toughest part on both sides of an acquisition. Joe, thanks so much for answering all my questions. I think you're going to get some better questions now from the audience, so I'm going to turn it over to Ajay and see what he has.
Yeah, great discussion. First of all, thank you, Joe and Vasant. I personally learned a lot, and I'm assuming that's the same case for everyone on the audience. I do have some really good questions coming our way. And at this time, I want to encourage everybody on the attendee list to please post your questions in the chat if you have not already. With that said, there are a couple of things, Joe, those are coming up. First one is, I think you briefly touched on it, but what's allowed and not allowed to be disclosed during the process overall? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so when we were going through the diligence, we had to make a very special effort to anonymize our customer data. So that when Google was looking at let's say the profile of our revenue or what the contractual arrangements were, they could not tie them to a particular customer. And so that was a very focused effort in terms of that. There was some concern around how much of the European employee data we could share at that time. And so we had to anonymize a lot of employee data, especially out of Europe, because of all the privacy concerns there. Those were the two biggest areas. At a secondary level, Google actually created these clean teams that would actually, so these were teams that were brought in from outside of Google Cloud to help understand, let's say, a deep dive on the technology. So how it was architected, how it was built, and so on, so that if indeed anything should happen, Google Cloud would be insulated from that knowledge and not have the potential perceived liability of having taken things they learned in the diligence process and then incorporated into their own operations.
Sure, that makes sense. Thank you. One interesting question, since you mentioned about the acquisition of Tableau, and one alumnus is asking, did you also receive any interest from Salesforce? There
are certain things I can say and certain things I can't, but let's just say that all the usual suspects that would be involved in a process like that were involved to a certain extent in our process.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. The next one is a very interesting question to both of you, since Vasant, you have also been on the other side as an acquirer. Being in the tech ecosystem, which big tech or internet companies do you think would get regulated first?
I'll let Joe answer that.
I figured you would do that.
Yeah, I have no idea, right? I mean, it's very hard to predict whether any will get regulated, and if they do, in what way. I think it's not predictable. A lot depends on the political environment. And there's also the question of law. Remember, a lot of law was set up in a very different era, right? It dates from the industrial trusts that existed at the turn of the 20th century. These are very different kinds of companies. So I don't even know if the law exists that's clear enough as to, if you were to regulate certain companies, how you would do it. What would be the law to do it?
Yeah, no, I agree. I had mentioned earlier that one of the rules in the UK for them to actually be able to legally do a deeper dive into this and slow down the process of acquisition is you had to prove a market category where the two companies had more than a 25% market share. And on the face of it, we do not. But they spent a lot of time trying to come to that conclusion in a very small market by pulling all that data. And I think the issue that they were most worried about was not that the combination itself today was anti-competitive, but that it would tend to, over time, because they're getting us early, freeze the competition in the future. And the thing is, I think the law was really meant to say, okay, those two are, that combination is anti-competitive now, but the concern that the UK seemed to have was, we're not worried so much now, we're worried about how we prove and prevent the future from happening. Because I think a lot of these early acquisitions that happened before, like a YouTube or an Instagram, they were bought early when there was not you couldn't probably block it under current law, but they grew to be a dominant force under their acquirers. And I think that's where people were trying to go, but the law does not support it yet.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you. I do have a number of questions coming in, so let's see how many we can cover in the next few minutes. The next one really is, and I think this ties back to your introduction, Joe, that you very nicely shared with the team, is at what stage do you think do startups really hire a CFO? Part number one of the question. Mm-hmm. Part two of the question is, primarily, having various investors, what are their liquidation preferences on a deal like this?
Yeah, so I'll start with the first. I think at Looker, it was unusual that I came in as early as I did. So that was a Series A company. Usually people will hire a CFO a little bit later stage, maybe Series C, when you've got more traction with customers. There's a bit more economic activity happening and the accounting becomes a little bit more complex. I came in early because of the relationships that I had. And early on, I saw that I really felt there was a strong product market fit. But typically, I think you're looking at a C. There are some companies that wait to actually do that. And I think it's dangerous to do that because what happens is you let problems build up. And as you grow, they become more and more difficult to fix. And so my belief is to do it a bit earlier is better. Liquidation preferences. So what typically happens is that liquidation preferences are set up for downside outcomes. So that if the company does not really succeed, the investors will get as much of their money back as they can, and the people who end up getting hurt are the common shareholders, which are typically the employees. In Looker's case, and then at some point those go away and it becomes more advantageous for the preferred investors then to convert their shares to common, because if you stay preferred, your return is capped, but if you convert to common, you can share the upside all the way up. In Looker's case, we greatly exceeded those preferences, and so all the preferred converted to common so that they could share all the way up to the full price of $2.6 billion. So the place where you worry about that is when you are not selling for much. So it's a distressed sale, for example. Liquidation preferences can also begin to stack up if it's at some point in your investing life you are not the strongest of companies and you can't ensure that the investors coming in don't get better terms than if you were a strong company early on.
Yep. Thank you for that. In the interest of time, I'm going to only take the last two questions really quick. The next question I have is, overall, what is the most effective way for large companies to identify and work with startups and small companies to really disrupt the industry? And this goes back to both you, Joe, and Vasant, to you as well, on the acquirer side, as you have been looking for such companies.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you from sort of our standpoint, if you're a large company, you have to acknowledge that the success rate on acquisitions is not high, right? So you have to go to it with a lot of humility because history would tell you that almost everyone doesn't have the perfect record on acquisitions. And so, our approach is you only buy if building is not an option, or it's faster to buy than to build, or cheaper to buy than to build. And then you do enough of your homework to assure yourself that the odds of success are high in terms of the quality of the company you're buying, the sort of the fit with the management team and things like that. And then how you manage the company post-acquisition is extremely important. You don't want to smother it with the bureaucracy of a large enterprise. At the same time, you need a certain level of oversight because you are accountable for whatever happens at that company. And it's a balancing act. And we learn from every one of them. It's a process where you have to be very selective.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can add as much there, but I think it's really important from my own perspective that large companies actually take the opportunity to work with smaller companies prior to even considering an acquisition, because it allows them to answer a lot of the questions that Vasant brought up. You understand sort of their selling motion. You get to understand a bit more about how customers perceive the technology, and how they might work together. It's not, it's still a bit of a process that you still have to go through when you integrate to do that better. But it allows you the opportunity, I think, to get a better impression and understanding of where that opportunity might lie. That at least was our experience, I think, in this transaction. But it's not always, that's not always available.
Thank you so much. One last question in the interest of time. We will have to wrap there. Personally, in what ways your Chicago Booth MBA has helped you achieve your career accomplishment is the next question.
Joe, you want to go first?
I'll go first. I think, it's interesting that this transaction was really all around a company that was very successful in the data analytics market. As I mentioned early on, I started very, very early at the company and really felt strongly about the way the product would be received because of the value it brought to the ability to analyze data, to understand how to run a company. And I think that, going back to University of Chicago, that sort of foundation that you get to really kind of understand, I was a finance focus, but understand, the importance of data and the understanding of how that works with finance, and really kind of how you operationalize the use of that financial data in how you run a business was kind of like the seed that was set. And through the course of time, as I went through my career, I never really regarded myself really as a CFO because I spent so much time operating in other parts of the business. I love spending time working with sales and the other parts of the business that are very transactional. And it's the value of understanding the data behind how you build the model of the business and how you build it over time. I think that was a seed that was planted back in those days and it really kind of made me, I think, appreciate the value of the opportunity that came to me back in 2013. And so, yeah, I think it was very helpful along the way.
Look, I mean, the University of Chicago helps in so many different ways, right? I mean, for me, I was an engineer when I went there. So whatever I learned about business, I learned there. And what was very good is that it exposes you to many elements of business. And at some point, you sort of think back on, oh yeah, I heard about that when I was at the University of Chicago. Clearly, the people you meet there, I think that's one of the best parts of what you get out of a business school. And frankly, I mean, it's a highly respected name, as you all know, and it never hurts to be a graduate of the University of Chicago. It is always something that helps you all the way through your career. You'll never regret being a graduate of the University of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so very much, both to Joe and Vasant. At this point, I would like to do a quick closing remark. We have 1 minute remaining. So everyone, whoever attended us today, hope you found this talk very delightful as well as informative. I certainly enjoyed a lot, and looking at all the questions, I feel like our attendees had a great time. So basically at this time, we want to remind you again that this is being possible by a group of volunteers who are active here in the Bay Area, as well as in West Coast and throughout everywhere from our school graduates. So basically, we invite you to continue to participate and join. Reach out to these people that you see on the screen now. And our club's mission is, at the end of the day, just to build a community where we all benefit together, intellectually, personally, professionally. And we have been doing a lot of good programming. This year has been very different, but we have adapted to this virtual way. But we don't stop here. We have amazing event coming up again on CFO. If you want to be a tech CFO, you do not want to miss this event. It's on August 18. Hoke, he is going to talk. He is the CFO of the venture-backed capital company called Infoblox, and we have many more. But if you have any questions, do want to participate, help us either schedule some event, want to ask any questions or anything, please do contact us and we will be glad to be in touch. One more time, Joe and Vasant, we are at time. It was a delightful discussion. Thank you so much for taking the time. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Ajay. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
With that, we conclude the event here. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.